Okay, so that's the last official lecture, but not the last point in our program, because we'll have a lot of discussions going on afterwards, and I hope that I can provoke some discussions during my lecture here. Actually, it's really hard for me to speak after such a very distinguished groups of professors and lecturers that were talking and lecturing before me. I'm just as you have already heard, because they were referring to that over and over again, especially my very dear friend Michael, I'm just a simple banker, not a very distinguished professor. And you have definitely learned, actually I'm even worse, I'm an ex-banker, not even a banker at this point in time. So you're a banker, Philip, so maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit later, how it is to live a life of a banker. I just had that the last 20 years and I was so fed up, so I got out of this. Anyway, so, but you've all heard and read in the media that bankers are basically the bad guys, especially during the financial crisis. So bankers were really the bad guys. Everyone else was good, but the bankers were ripping off all goodies from a starving society. So I kept calling myself, when I introduced myself to an audience like this, I kept calling myself a bankster rather than a banker. Because if I said banker, sometimes people didn't really know how they should relate to that. But when I said I'm a bankster, you could immediately see in the auditorium, you know, that was easy for them. Sorry, what?
The worst version.
The worst version, yeah, absolutely. I was absolutely the worst. But, so they went all, like you did right now. So, but I'm so happy, and this is a little bit of a testimony here, that I can tell you that besides being a bankster, I'm a believer. Funny enough, huh? And not just a believer in something, but in something very special, because I believe in Jesus Christ. And I'm convinced that once and at the end of my life, He will hold me responsible, hold me accountable for what I was doing as a bankster and beyond, obviously. So kind of this tames, I guess, and orders my desires and deeds, and I guess it makes me a better man. I once horrified the wife of a very good friend of mine. She's also a friend of mine, maybe a little bit less now, but I once horrified her because during a dinner, and she's not a believer, and he is, and they're having kind of a bit of troubles because of that. But once, so she asked me, so why do you need to believe? I mean, what is it, you know? And I said, you know, actually, and it was a little bit provocative, I admit, but I said, well, if I would not be a believer, then you should rather take good care, because I would kill and steal and rob and rape and everything, you know? Because why should you be a good guy if this is all you get? And 80, 90, 120 years later, it's all over. You're just seeing the potatoes from underneath, and that's it, you know? No life after. No responsibility, no nothing. I mean, it makes no sense to be a good guy. But then she said, wow, but you want to have friends. And I said, that's total rubbish. This argument is such a rubbish, because if you're really a brutal gangster or whatever, you know, and you're stealing a lot of money, so you're becoming very wealthy and you're becoming very powerful, you automatically have a lot of friends. Okay, I'll forsake some, but I'll get a lot of others who want to take benefit of me. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I said, it's for me, it's very necessary, and I think for all our society, it's necessary that we believe in God and that we understand that He will hold us accountable. Her husband called me the next morning and he said, what did you tell my wife? I said, why? He said, she didn't let me sleep a single second this night. She always wanted to discuss with me what you have said, and I didn't really get, because she was so upset, you know. So I don't know what's going on. Obviously, I pressed a button there. Anyways, so we were, this lecture consists of many different lectures that I was doing in the past, and lots of things were already said. The problem with this lecture is it was supposed to be the starting lecture of this seminar, and not the closing lecture. It was supposed to give an outline to what we are going to talk about, and now it's rather a summary of what we were talking about. But maybe that's also not bad. Still, you will hear a lot of things that you have already heard. I guess it will come a little bit from, at times, a different perspective, and I will elaborate a little bit on some things that were not elaborated on yet, even so they were mentioned. But anyway, so and on top of it, most of it is about economics. And as I believe, and as also Hayek once said, and economics is not a science in itself. Economics is part of the larger field of social sciences. And social sciences is about the human being and its interaction with other human beings. So is the economy. We've heard that before. So it's about the human being and what it is to interact and how we should interact with other human beings. So first of all, I'm always asking myself, and when I understood that it's important for me that I am a believer, because that makes me a better person, at least I hope, then I asked myself, so what is it that makes me a better person? Or what is it that makes me different to others who are eventually non-believers or are not conscious that they are in fact believing in something or in God? So we have heard that, and that was stressed several times, that we have learned as Christians that we are created in the image and likeness of God, our Creator. So then actually we can go two ways. We can ask, how or who are we as human beings? Or we can ask, because we are created in His image, how is He? If I would come from a lesser Christian position, then I would most probably, and that's basically what I understood how Hayek started out. He asked himself, so how is the human being? He wanted to understand the human being and its interactions with others. And I'm starting out with asking, so how is God? Because if I understand how He is, at least some central points, then I might better understand how I am and who I am. So do you have any ideas? Just throw out some things. So how is He? How is God? You have any ideas? Just flashlights. Okay, actually, you are not allowed to speak because you've heard this lecture several times. You can give it, in fact. So you shut up. Anyways, what? Huh? His love, yeah. 1 point. Love. Creative, wonderful, yes. Mighty, yes, true. Almighty, even. Wow, even more. Faithful, yes, right. Yes, absolutely. In Jesus Christ, He became flesh, right? Humble, yeah. Okay, there, basically, most of it was in there already. First of all, and utmost, He is free. Absolutely free. He's totally free. And out of His freedom, He created creation, obviously. But that's very important. The central point, He's absolutely free. He's not bound, limited, or restricted by anything except His own rules. His own rules and regulation. And this is very important because He based His creation on a certain set of rules of interaction. Yeah? Certain, we call that natural law. To an extent that's what we understand as natural law. And He obeys to His own rules. That's why He can say, in Jesus, He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So He is all true. He's absolutely reliable. That was just said. He is totally consistent with His own laws and promises. So first He's free, but then He's the truth, and He obeys to His own rules. He is the creator, that was said. He is the creator. He created everything and wanted it to progress from there. He is community. That was not said. He is community. That's very important. He's community. He is the Father, and the Son, and from them derives the Holy Spirit, which is the love between the Father and the Son, personified as the third person of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. One God in three persons. And he is pure love. His love is so strong that it becomes itself a person, the Holy Spirit. So, and by the way, where do we come closest to, actually to God, to depicting God? Where do we come closest to God in our mankind, in the way we are as human beings? Where do we get closest to his image and likeness?
In love.
In love, and in particularly? When we create new life, when we form a family, the Father, the Son, and the love from them derives as the third person, the Holy Spirit, becomes a third person. The Father and the Mother, and the love between the two of them, the product of this love is the third person, the child. So this is where we come closest to the Holy Trinity. So this is why the family, the traditional family, one man and one woman, oriented towards the child or children. This is where we get closest to God, and this is why family has such an enormous value within creation and within our society. So always keep that in mind, and we know all the attacks on family right now. So if we know that about God, then we know a lot about us as human beings, about man. So God is free, so also man is created free and oriented towards exercising his freedom. Cardinal Schönborn, our cardinal here in Vienna, last year in Rome at a conference where I was present, he said, during his sermon, he said, freedom is the greatest gift from God to man. Freedom is the greatest gift from God to man. Man should take free decisions, not act because he's forced to or coerced, but because he deliberately decides to do not what he wants to do, not necessarily what he wants to do, but what he ought to do. So he should live his vocation. So we'll get back to that. Man is created, second, to seek truth and always follow her. Freedom and truth. And truth is necessary in order to understand the rules of nature and the rules of interaction. Many things that we have already heard here. Man is oriented towards community, because God is community. We are also oriented towards community. We should form societies, live amongst and together with others, cooperate with others, support others, communicate with others. Not necessarily always only on Twitter and Facebook, but also there. Next point, man should be creative because God is the creator. We should be creative. We should strive for progress as to fulfill this vocation. And we should become co-creators in many aspects, but especially in family life. We should become co-creators. And man needs his freedom, especially for his highest goal, and that is to love God and his brothers and sisters, his brethren around him. And love can only be true love if it's given out of a free decision of the one who loves. Very logical. You can never go to another person and say, and now, love me. Yeah? You can never force anyone to love you. I mean, some people pay for love, but that's not love, you know. It's important to understand that love is always possible only if it's given out of a free will. John Paul II always said true love always needs to be based on a free decision to love. But obviously, to make this decision implies our freedom to choose. So let's make a very brief excursus about the two major elements here. Well, all of them are major, but very important for me, freedom and truth. Freedom, John Paul II, the great John Paul, Saint John Paul II once said, and I love this sentence, and I'm always quoting it. Everyone who heard this lecture knows that this sentence is always coming in each one of my lectures because it is such an important sentence. John Paul II once said, imagine a world in which everyone would do good. Are you there? A world in which everyone would do good. It's a wonderful world, beautiful, isn't it? Imagine a world in which everyone would do good, but not because he or she deliberately decides to do so, but because he is forced to do so. Such a world is much closer to hell than to heaven. Wow, that's a U-turn, isn't it? I mean, we really need, and Pope Benedict, this sentence is not a big exception in the magisterium of the Church, because Pope Benedict wrote in his encyclical letter, Spe Salvi, very much the same, even so in a little bit different words. He said, if there were structures which could irrevocably guarantee a determined good state of the world, man's freedom would be denied. And hence, they would not be good structures at all. Further to that, he underlines a little bit later in Spe Salvi, human affairs depend in each generation on the free decisions of those concerned. If this freedom were to be taken away as a result of certain conditions or structures, then ultimately this world would not be good, since a world without freedom can by no means be a good world. It's tough, you know. We need to be aware of that. And we need maybe, and this is my lecture is about the big policy fallacies, especially in Europe, but also in the United States and many places of the world, because I guess the direction everywhere in the world is directed to the same end, which I'm not very positive about at this point. So let's talk, or let's think about a little bit in the back of our head, if we consider this world that needs to be free in order to be a good world. People, we human beings need to be free in order to become fully a human person. And then we see that in the light of our overboarding and heavily indebted welfare states, confiscatory tax regimes, ever-growing regulations. We've been talking about that. So we need to ask ourselves whether we already crossed the line eventually into a world that is not good anymore. Caritas in Veritate says, or in Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict says, only when it is free can development be integrally human. Only in a climate of responsible freedom can it grow in a satisfactory manner. So our freedom constitutes a supreme value of the human person. But now we could say, okay, that's the church. But are there other sources who argue in the same direction? And I love one source, and I highly recommend to read his books. It's Viktor Frankl. Have you ever heard about Viktor Frankl? So he's the founder, he's a famous psychiatrist, and he was the founder of the third school of psychology. What is the first school of psychology? The famous 3 Viennese schools. Anyone knows? First school? Freud? Who said Freud? You said Freud. Very good. Very good. So the first is Freud, psychoanalysis, obviously. Second is, that's tough. No. Adler. Adler, exactly. Individual psychology. And then the third is Viktor Frankl. And it's logotherapy or existential analysis. Viktor Frankl was talking about meaning, or better, our search for meaning for our lives. And Viktor Frankl wrote a tremendous book. It's a short, tiny little book, but I really recommend all of you to read it. It's called The Unconscious God. The Unconscious God. And there, Viktor Frankl, who was Jewish, though close to the Catholic Church, but he was Jewish, he said that our conscience draws on a role model. If we take decisions, if we especially decide between what is good and evil, then our conscience draws on a role model that it cannot find within himself, within ourselves. So obviously there must be some sort of a higher role model that our conscience reverts to. And this is what he calls the unconscious God. So how is it, says Freud, that this strange animal running on two legs called man or woman really becomes a human person? So he says the real human being, he says in this book, the real human being starts where someone is not driven by his pure instincts and emotions anymore, but where the person actively starts taking decisions, and therefore where he or she starts being responsible for his actions. So without being able to decide on your own, we cannot be held responsible for what we did. Responsibility requires the freedom to act and to deliberately taking decisions. But being responsible means becoming a human person. So responsibility makes the difference. I always come up with this maybe stupid example of the lion. If the lion is hunting in the desert, he sees the gazelle. Even so, the gazelle might be endangered species. You cannot stop the lion and say, sorry, I have to explain to you. The gazelle, it's maybe the last gazelle on the planet. If you kill and eat this one gazelle, the species of gazelles is dying out. So think about it. You cannot do this. The lion will say, excuse me, my instinct is there is a gazelle. Here is a strange feeling in my stomach, which is called hunger, and I will hunt down this stupid gazelle and eat it. And there is no question about that. But you can't hold the lion responsible for that because he cannot distinguish and he's not free. He's driven by his instincts. But exactly that is what the welfare state destroys at the end of the day. Not the instincts. The instincts are there, but taking free decisions and taking responsibility. We have been talking about the welfare state. It destroys our ability to a certain extent to taking our own decisions and therefore our ability to being held responsible for our actions. If we need to pay a major portion of our salary to the state and the state cares for our retirement, our medical care, our unemployment insurance, the kindergarten we're sending our kids to, schools, universities, all is for free. Down the way, all to the media information that we get presented, what we are allowed to consume or not to consume, we will not be able to take responsibility for our life at the end of the day. So we really need to think about what's going on within our society. So that's short about freedom. Now about truth. Pope Benedict says in Caritas in Veritate, fidelity to man requires fidelity to the truth, which alone is the guarantee of freedom and of the possibility of integral human development. It's also a strong sentence. But today, and I don't know whether that also happened to you, because to me it happens every second day when I'm starting to be engaged in some sort of a discussion with someone who is not coming basically from the same background, intellectual background like myself. It's always, you very easily come to the point where the other person says that truth does not exist. You try to revert to something, you try to make a point, and the counter-argument most of the time is, well, that's nice, absolutely. I totally tolerate your opinion. And then you can say, well, that's not an opinion, it's true. Yeah, well, that's your subjective opinion. Obviously, I can have a different opinion. Yeah, sure, you can have a different opinion, absolutely. But only if it's, most of the time, if it's contradicting opinions, only one of them can be true. Except if truth does not exist, because then everything is possible, anything goes. I just remember, and I love to tell this story, which is it was a little bit rude from me, I have to admit. I had headache, and so that's a simple excuse, but I had a discussion with a girl. She was a journalist from the Austrian television, and I had criticized her boss in a huge gathering for something that he had said. And she came to me afterwards, and she wanted to defend her boss, which was actually a nice approach. And she said, yeah, you know, I really appreciate what you said. It was very interesting, but it's your opinion, and my boss has a different opinion. You have to accept that. And I said, yeah, that's true, but I mean, only one of us can be right, because there is only one truth. And she said, no, there is no truth. It's all opinion. So I said, so is that right? There is no truth? Are you really sure that there is no truth? And she said, yeah, sure. So everything is just subjective opinion. You can believe that, I believe that. And then I said, well, but that's a problem, because then the sentence that you will once die does not hold. Most probably you will never die. Sure. Are you following me? So she was thinking a little bit. She considered herself a smart girl. And then she smiles and she said, yeah, right. Maybe I will never die. I thought, oh my God, that's going to be a tough one. So I said, yeah, but then also the other side or the other end of your life is problematic, because then you most probably never have been born. And she thought it's funny. She said, yeah, maybe I've never been born. And I said, yes, but if you have never been born, you're not here now, and I don't have to talk to you anymore. Good night. So I left her. Her boss was laughing. You know, he called me the other day and he asked me a couple of questions. But anyways, so this happens if we deny that truth as such exists. Already Pope Leo XIII, who is very important when we are talking about Catholic social teaching, because he actually started officially. Well, there was a long history of church teaching about the relationships between human beings. But Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical, started the official church teaching on Catholic social teaching. And he said that it is our severe moral obligation to long for the truth and always uphold it in order to use our freedom properly. In other words, not all that I can freely choose to do would be good, proper, honest, and true, and should therefore be done. Therefore, the search for truth is the indispensable prerequisite for the proper use of our freedom, and in this sense, for any human action. Pope Benedict XVI underlined that by even calling his last, I guess it was the first encyclical from Pope Francis was also written together with, at least together, let's say, with Pope Emeritus Benedict. But let's say the last official encyclical was, I guess, Caritas in Veritate. So he wrote an encyclical that is about truth, love in truth. He argues on close to 70 pages that charity in truth, as he puts it, charity in truth, to which Jesus Christ bore witness with his earthly life and especially by his death and resurrection, is the principal driving force between the authentic development of every person and of all humanity. Through adherence to this truth, he says, man, becomes free. And then he goes on saying, to defend truth, to articulate it with humility and conviction, and to bear witness to it in life, are therefore exacting and indispensable forms of charity. So that's really an important statement. So, but now again, if we are thinking about truth, let us ask ourselves about the new gender ideology that tries to convince us that our sex is merely a social construction, but not a reality. It's a social construct, absolutely. Today, I'm a man. Tomorrow, I might be a girl. The day after, I don't know. I'm undecided. It is LGBTY. I'm so proud that I know what the Y stands for, because that's intersex. So we are not really decided, what we are. Isn't it crazy? They're telling you, I mean, at universities, you have to, at least in Austria, I don't know, you are still at the university, if you hand in a diploma thesis, it needs to be gendered. Isn't that true? You cannot have a non-gendered thesis in Austria. Where are we? Let us ask ourselves about how honest it is to lament about our population decline. The demographic disaster, we have heard about that, and I'll touch it a little bit later. The demographic disaster we are facing, at least with the so-called old world, within the so-called old world, and thus the nearing collapse of our welfare state systems. And at the same time, we are aborting, murdering hundreds of thousands of babies each year. Let us ask ourselves about the honesty and the truth of trying over and over again to grow out of our national debt by creating artificial, we've heard about that, artificial GDP growth and tax revenue growth by simply creating inflation, which deprives especially the small savers society of their hard-earned possessions, which should actually serve as their reserves for retirement or economic hardship. In this context, we could also talk about the publicized inflation figures, which I question very much. The rates compared with the so-called micro or mini baskets that really account for the purchasing power losses of the small savers. So you have one very small inflation figure, which is the official figure, but then ask any housewife that needs to go to the supermarket and go shopping, and that sees prices rising on, maybe not on a daily, maybe not on a weekly, but on a monthly level at least. I was once, that was already 3-4 years ago, I was on a panel with the CEO of a major bank here in Austria, and beside us there was also the governor, then governor, now he's a different one, the then governor of the Austrian National Bank. And he said, and we were talking about inflation, and I was talking about the very high real overall market inflation rate. And the governor was really becoming like frantic, saying like, no, that's not true, that's rubbish, very low, and he was really angry with me. Didn't even shake my hand afterwards, so angry he was. But then the CEO of this bank said, yeah, in fact, we have our internal calculations. So since the euro started in 2002 in Austria, and that was, I guess it was 2010 or 11, I'm not sure. He said, but since then, we have an overall market inflation rate between 10 to 12%. I feel it's a little bit exaggerated. I would rather say it's about 6%, but if they have their calculation with 10 to 12%, let it be. So this is what we are talking about, or one of the elements what we are talking about if we talk about truth. So very briefly about Catholic social teaching, because we've heard a lot about Christian anthropology, which I tried to outline a little bit now, and then we need to ask ourselves, so this strange human being that we just defined, how is he interacting with other human beings? And we've heard a lot about that already. Just a very brief overview. So the two major principles of Catholic social teaching are the principle of solidarity and the principle of subsidiarity. We were talking about that. Solidarity, very logical. We need to understand that we are both bound together, but also responsible for each other. Without solidarity, obviously no community could live together peacefully and prosperously. Society, you can also say in another picture, society is one chain of people, and it is just as strong as its weakest link. This is a very simplified picture, but it comes close to the truth. Subsidiarity, on the other side, means that a higher authority, we've been talking about that, or a higher governing body should only get involved in case a lower level can not entirely, sufficiently, or at all provide certain services or goods needed in order to promote the common good. The higher level should always strive to provide help just in order to start self-sustaining processes on the lower level. And after that works, should immediately withdraw, not like our welfare states that provide continuous transfers, wealth redistribution, and involvement. Only to provide help, but mainly for the receiver to get back on his or her feet and being put into the situation of being able to walk again alone without our help in the future. Help in order to help yourself. We should not enter into systems of lasting dependencies which would ultimately eliminate freedom and love. Again, Pope Benedict in Caritas in Veritate. So the overall aim, as we've heard, is striving for the common good. I have to admit I have a problem with this expression. Because I never, I mean, you can get, and we had that here, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit later during the Q&A together with the two other gentlemen who are here, and all of you, obviously. What is the common good? How do you really define the common good? There are explanations, but I thought they're never sufficient. I never really get it. And maybe my part of the common good, where I feel comfortable, are very different to the common good of each one of you. Everyone has different preferences in life. Well, the sum of all the preferences and the fulfillment of all that is the common good. What does it mean? Maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into that. The central point of reference is the common good. The common good is based on three central elements. Most of them we talked about. First of all, respect for the human person, and that is connected to protection of the freedom to act. We had that. Protection of our private lives and private properties. Very important. We were talking about private property rights. Imagine Cicero. You are aware of Cicero? Cicero said that to violate someone's property is to do enormous damage to the social order. To violate someone's property means to do enormous damage to the social order. So, protection of the freedom to practice my religious life is the third. Second major point, promotion of the social well-being and the development of the common good. Here we go again. The authority, we need authority. Authority is nothing bad. So these anarcho-liberals get it wrong, because we need authorities within our societies, because the authority has to mediate between individual interests and preferences, obviously. Otherwise, the famous sentence, man becomes man's wolf. Huh? The authority has to provide for basic needs in order to secure a human life for each individual, where this particular individual cannot care for himself. And again, the authority just has to start the process. Get you on your feet again, but you need to walk alone. Peace is the third major point, belongs to the rule of law and the protection of internal and external peace, stability, and security. And what are the driving forces, the creative forces? We've been talking about that already, the cleaning forces, the supporting forces behind stability and development of any society, and therefore promotes the common good. It is the virtues. Therefore, our conference is called Toward a Free and Virtuous Society. It is the virtues that are prevailing within a society. We've been talking about that. The concept of virtues, by the way, and I have a lot of sympathy for that, comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote this very famous book, the Ethica Nicomacheia, the Nicomachean Ethics. This is another book that every one of you needs to read. Nicomachean Ethics. I love this book, and it's so charming because actually Aristotle wrote this book for his son Nicomachos. That was his name. So basically he wrote down, look, I mean, I thought about how to lead a proper life, how to become a better person, and I'm writing that down for you so that you can read it, you can learn it, and you can become a better person. I think it's very nice of a father to do that for his son. So he's talking there about the four major virtues, the cardinal virtues, which is prudence, we've heard that, justice, courage, and moderation. So these are, in a nutshell, the major points that we wanted to talk about. We were talking about freedom, we were talking about the economy. There is a very strong sentence, let me just see. There is a very strong sentence by Pope Paul VI. And Pope Benedict thinks this sentence is so very important that he even quoted it in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate. It's a tough sentence. You would not think that it comes from a pope. And he says that Pope Benedict writes, Pope Paul VI was in no doubt that obstacles and forms of conditioning hold up development. But he was certain that, quote, each one remains, whatever be these influences affecting him, the principal agent of his own success or failure. Is that the ideology behind our welfare states? That we are the principal agent of our own success or failure? So let's talk about markets. Markets, and now we're getting closer to my actual, after 1 hour, no, I'm just talking, when did we start actually? 6:30? 6 o'clock, oh, thank you very much, you're dead. Okay, anyways, 6:30, okay. So if we talk about the economy, we've been talking a lot back and forth about the economy, whether it's something bad, whether we should be afraid of the economy, the market economy, whether you call it free market economy or capitalism. But our media and our politicians most of the time convey a rather dark picture if they are talking about free market economy / capitalism. So in Populorum Progressio, again, Pope Paul VI is talking about, closely connected to our notion about it's not a static view. The economy is not a static view. It's not this pie that we've seen in one of the videos. It can, and that remains the same. So if one gains at some point, another one needs to lose. That's not the reality. So there is progress in our society and also progress in our economy. And then there are many people, especially on the left, who are saying we should be satisfied with what we have. We should not always strive for having more. Progress is bad. But that's not true, because in Populorum Progressio, Paul VI taught that progress, in its origin and essence, is first and foremost a vocation. He says, in the design of God, every man is called upon to develop and fulfill himself, for every life is a vocation. The vocation to progress drives us to do more, know more, and have more in order to be more. So obviously progress and development is something positive. So what does the church say about the market economy itself? One tool for this progress is the market economy, and Pope Benedict XVI refers to that by saying the church has always held that economic action is not to be regarded as something opposed to society. Economy and finance, the banksters, and finance as instruments can be used badly when those at the helm are motivated by pure selfish ends, obviously. He goes on saying, instruments that are good in themselves can thereby be transformed into harmful ones. Therefore, it is not the instrument that must be called to account, but individuals, their moral conscience, and their personal and social responsibility. He goes on saying every economic decision has a moral consequence, but also that it's good for people to realize that purchasing is always a moral and not simply economic act. Hence, the consumer has a specific social responsibility, which goes hand in hand with the social responsibility of the enterprise. And then he also goes on talking even about globalization. We've been talking especially also during fighting poverty, etc., about globalization. And he says globalization a priori is neither good nor bad. It will be what people make of it. But blind opposition would be a mistaken and prejudiced attitude, incapable of recognizing the positive aspects of the process. Globalization has been the principal driving force behind the emergence from underdevelopment of whole regions, and in itself it represents great opportunity. So it seems that the Pope Benedict, is very positive on globalization and has a very positive attitude towards the free market economy. So what then are, and that's the last part, and now I could start talking for hours, but I will not bore you too much, but now we need to hold what I've just said in the back of our minds and ask ourselves, so what is going on in our economy, especially here in Europe, but America is following suit. And a good friend of Michael and me, Sam Gregg, has written a very good book. It's called Becoming Europe. It's written for an American audience to warn them not to make the same mistake as the Europeans. But they are making the same mistakes already. They are already following suit, and that's what he argues in this book. But then he tries to outline a little bit the mistakes that we are making. And we need to ask ourselves, what is wrong? In short, I would say the EU is drawn down by an overboarding welfare state that demands high levels of taxation, high levels of wealth redistribution, but still brought about an ever-growing government debt burden, overboarding regulations that together with heavy government and European Central Bank intervention distorted the free market forces and lead to a mindset, and that's important, and lead to a mindset of complacency and risk aversion by its citizens, who would rather live on subsidies or work for the government than take the risk and start a business or become part of the free market. On top of that, Europe is facing a huge drop in fertility rate, which turns its demographics into an aging society with growing numbers of old, retired, and sick people, and a shrinking number of young people in the active workforce that need to support the older generation. At the root of all that lies a huge market distortion. And we've heard so much from Friedrich August von Hayek, but actually the teacher of Hayek was Ludwig von Mises. And Ludwig von Mises, also a very prominent representative of the Austrian School of Economics, has a very influential quote. And now it's just a question if it's coming up. Yeah, it's coming up. And again, where's my mouse? Here's my mouse. Exactly. Ludwig von Mises, what is going on here? Does it work? A little bit. Well, anyways, Ludwig von Mises explained in 1931, talking about the economic depression of the time that was getting worse and worse, and he said, if everything possible is done to prevent the market from fulfilling its function of bringing supply and demand into balance, it should come as no surprise that a serious disproportionality between supply and demand persists. That commodities remain unsold. Well, commodities get sold up until now in our situation, but factories stand idle. Many millions are unemployed. Destruction and misery are growing. We see that on the streets of Greece, Spain, Portugal. And that finally in the wake, Italy, France, and that finally in the wake of all these destructive radicalism is rampant in politics. I've just met a couple of politicians at a conference in Rome. I said that, and there were two French congressmen, French members of parliament, and they told me, which I had not known, but I then Googled it on YouTube, and you can see the videos on YouTube. They said that they're having riots every day in France. Right now, while we are speaking, there are cars burning in France on the streets of all the major cities. There is districts where the French police does not dare to go in anymore, like in Paris, in le banlieue de Paris. They don't dare to go in there, or in Toulon or so. So there is really a very dangerous situation in France. Our media is not talking about that at all. These two parliamentarians told me that that's a fact in France. And in Greece, I've seen that in Greece. I've been on the major square, the Syntagma Square in Athens, and in all the side streets, you saw special units of heavily armed policemen and like similar like tank cars standing there, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, because there was every day the threat of civil war and of riots breaking out in Athens. It was not a very convenient situation. He goes on saying, with the economic crisis, the breakdown of interventionist policy, the policy being followed today by all governments, irrespective of whether they are responsible to parliaments or rule openly as dictatorships, becomes apparent. Hampering the functions of the market and the formation of prices does not create order. Instead, it leads to chaos, to economic crisis. Cicero 200 years before Christ. What? 2,000 years before. He said, what? No. Before how? What? But Cicero after Christ. No, when was Cicero? Before?
No, after.
50, what?
First century before.
Before, exactly, 50 years before Christ. 100 to 50 years before Christ. He said government budgets, well, I'm just happy that it was not only me that was shaky here. Anyways, Cicero says government budgets need to be balanced already back then. Public debt needs to be reduced. The arrogance of government agencies and civil servants needs to be tamed and controlled. The transfers to foreign governments must be reduced for the state not to become bankrupt. And people, and that's the major part, and people need to learn again to work and earn their living rather than living on government subsidies. That was already back then in the very early years before or around Christianity started and Christ lived. And now a big jump, 2,000 years, a very modern statement. The Black Summit Group, I guess this is this here. Exactly, the Black Summit Financial Group is talking in a very recent research paper about the European malaise, as they call it. And they say that over the course of the last 2 weeks, that was mid of August, we have observed Italy falling into a triple recession, France recording zero growth rate, and Germany, the engine of European growth, even portraying a negative growth rate. It has long been our argument that the EU, they say, is the crown jewel of bureaucratization, run by bureaucrats who have never run businesses in their lives, knowing only to regulate and tell successful business people that they owe more taxes while hindering productivity growth. The EU is a wonderful vision, they say. It's a wonderful vision and has a marvelous future as long as it unwinds its bureaucracy, relaxes its labyrinth of rules, and focuses on the free movement of goods, services, capital, technology, and people. Then they're talking about the so-called Texas ratio. With banks, they're saying that the European banks are really in trouble and shaking. I will not bore you with that. We can go into that if you're interested later on. But they said that, for example, the Danish Institute for International Studies demonstrated that the recapitalization of European banks is almost non-existent, based on the leverage ratios, which is the connection between the equity of the banks and the cash and the debt that they are holding. From the 24 largest banks in Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, actually only 7 increased their leverage ratio, they say. So they end their report with the sentence, "Welcome to the world of confused disequilibria," market distortions, like Mises said, disequilibria, where perceptions are portrayed as realities. Perceptions are portrayed as realities. As you enjoy the upswing, they say, start taking cover for the possible tsunami that may be pacing and gathering speed somewhere in the angelic land of the EU. So we have been talking about the welfare society, social Europe as we call it. We are so proud about that. But, well, actually, social Europe started in the late 19th century. Bismarck, we were talking about that. Wilhelm Röpke said that in the 1950s, a German economist pointed out that the welfare state is like the progressive taxation. Once one accepts the basic principle, there is nothing in the welfare state's conception to set a limit to it. And that's the dangerous concept. And he goes on saying, once European parliaments, European politicians, one might add politicians all over the world, recognized that the state's ability to spend was one way of building up reliable constituencies of voters, political parties were able to enter into bidding wars, handing out the goodies to their voters. But strong government intervention and the buildup of large welfare states comes at a huge cost. First, a breakdown of solidarity. We were already talking about that. Gradual dulling of productivity. European welfare states have created strong incentives not to work. Cicero foresaw that already 2,000 years ago. The World Bank stated in one report on European economies that work incentives are weaker in Europe. For example, in 2010, they report French employees worked an average of 620 hours. France, 620 hours. German workers already worked 700 hours. Americans worked 870 hours. It's a huge gap. Then growing obstacles to reform, sclerotic politics heavily dependent on their constituencies that they purchased with the social benefits in the first place need to find ways to finance the ever-growing welfare demands and are absolutely unable to cut their spending on the other end. The tax burden is growing to unsustainable levels. Already in 1998, there was a report on from the Kiel Institute of World Economy that stated that back then it was the Deutschmark in Germany. Now the equivalent would be the euro. They said that for every every Deutschmark that is taxed out of the wealth-producing sectors, turned through state bureaucracies and trickled back into the economy, this D-mark has lost about 50% of its purchasing power. And I guess I even have, exactly, you see some other studies on that. You have the Kiel Institute on top. You see that calculations show that an increase in 1% in taxes would reduce GDP for 1.8% and would increase or reduce employment 1.14%. Study of the American Economic Review shows that each US dollar paid to the government would bring about a loss for the economy of 33.2 cents, and so on and so forth. So really, taxes needed for certain duties that governments have to fulfill, but taxes are always dangerous because taxes are really a threat to productivity, to a growing economy. And then, last but not least, and we've also been talking about that, welfare states lead to an ethical deterioration of the people living within welfare societies. So we need to ask ourselves, can the welfare state support a culture of virtues and ethical acting individuals, or is it rather undermining the ethical base of its subjects? Karen Horn, she is the current president of the Hayek Foundation in Germany, once talked about the fading ethical values within a welfare society. She talks about the changes in mentality of the people caused by the welfare state because private initiatives, self-responsibilities, work ethics, etc. are all deteriorating. In a state, if a state distributes a lot of funds, many people will wake up and claim their part of these funds, she says. So that creates negative desires and supports cheating and therefore criminal practices. Assa Lindbeck, former member of the Swedish Nobel Prize Committee, he wrote that any modern society builds its system upon following social norms. You shall not steal. You shall not commit fraud. Pay your taxes properly and only receive those transfer payments that you are entitled to. But then he goes on, but the more developed a welfare state is, the more it supports its citizens to offend those principles, very simply due to the concept of rising opportunity costs of ethical behavior by rising transfer payment. Lindbergh's thesis says the growing social welfare state destroys the ethical norms and morals of its people. And Friedrich Heinemann from the Center of European Economic Research confirms this thesis with recent empirical research. He says the growing welfare state led ultimately to a diminishing morality amongst society. The more transfer payments are available within the system, the lower the moral standards to act properly to achieve those payments or be eligible. Figures show, he says, that the elder generation being brought up before the development of a strong modern welfare state has higher standards than the younger generation. The higher unemployment, the lower are the moral standards, he goes on saying. I have a chart here, let me see. Yeah, here you see, for example, you see GDP growth. You see, on the other hand, this is unfortunately very, very small. This is basically saying, is there the mouse? No. This is basically saying the right chart, which you cannot see, but maybe you can look at it afterwards a little bit. It says how much does an employer need to pay directly to the government, plus the individual receiving a salary needs to pay in taxes and social benefits to the government, social transfers to the government, in order to receive at the end just €1 in net money on his account. And then it's even small for me. For example, in Belgium, the overall cost in order for the individual to have €1 that he can then spend, the overall cost is 2.34 euros. In France, it's 2.16. In Austria, it's 2.11 euros. The EU average is 1.73 euros. So you have to imagine that in order that you get €1 net on your bank account or into your hand, in average in Europe, one needs to pay 1.73 euro. The 0.73 go to the state. But then you have this €1 and then you go shopping. And then you pay VAT taxes, or you pay gasoline tax, or you pay Nova in Austria if you buy a car, which is a Normverbrauchsabgabe, which most of you don't know. Anyways, so you can see the chart below. There you can see that spending as a percentage of GDP between 1960 till 2000, spending as a percentage of GDP was growing. 1960 it was just 29% of GDP, and now 2010 it's 53% in average. And on the other hand, you see the annual growth of GDP in the EU, and the higher the spending, the government spending of GDP grew, the lower GDP growth was. So there is an interconnection between the part of government intervention and spending in terms of GDP and GDP growth. Here you see an interesting chart, again from the Black Summit Group, where they say if we would go on the federal regulations level of 1949, so the regulations the federal government in the US put forward to the economy in 1949, if we still would have the same level, that would be our GDP right now, $53.9 trillion US. Actually, it's just 15.1 trillion. The gap here is destroyed by the overboarding regulation in the US, and it's way worse in Europe. Here you see a little bit, it's all very small, and unfortunately when I did it I didn't know. You can. It's larger, but we don't see anything now, which is also good. Anyway, so you see a comparison of central bank balance sheets. This is another big lie that we are living on. Oops. Now I get seasick. Okay. The value of our money is imploding because if our central banks, and well, you should see here actually that that starts in 1995 till 2013, and it's the extension of the balance sheets of the different central banks, the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, then the ECB, and the Japanese Central Bank. On the other side, you see American government debt from 2000 till 2013, and also the lower charts are the balance sheet, the debt that is held on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. So you see an exploding government debt. Here you see budget deficits and developments of budget deficits in relation to the GDP. The budget deficits on the left side, and the overall debt to GDP ratio for the different countries on the right side. And you see here a line. That's the funny thing. We have European treaties, as you know. The European Union is not jumping out of a box. It's obviously built upon certain treaties. So this would be the Maastricht criteria here. Everyone who is going beyond that is violating the Maastricht Treaty, which is one of the founding treaties of the European Union, or European Financial or Economic Union. And then here you see Maastricht criterion, 3% debt to 3% deficit to GDP would be the largest possible deficit, and you see what actually many of the countries are doing, and I would even doubt most of these figures. Here you see the aging society. We have been talking about Korea. You see the longer bars, the red bars or brown, I don't know how you see the colors here. I see red and blue. So the red bars are in 2060 compared to 2015. The number of people who are more than 65 years old calculated on a sample of 100, or compared to a sample of 100 people between the age of 15 to 64. Why 15 to 64? Because that's the active workforce. So simply what that tells you, how many people of the active workforce now have to support people that are already retired. You know, we have a pay-as-you-go system where nothing is saved for retirement, everything is paid by the people in the active workforce. Now 17.9 people are supported by 17.9 retired people in Korea are supported by 100 people in the active workforce. In 2060, it will be 84.6 retired people that need to be supported by the active workforce. So you see, here you have the Netherlands, you have Canada, you have China. China is also exploding, Germany. So you have the figures here, and you can ask yourself whether that is a sustainable level. Yeah, and that's the root cause of this problem. That's the fertility rates. You all know, and Philip was talking about that 2.1% is the level, 2.1 children per woman is the level to sustain the current number of society. And we had, in 1955 to 60, we had in the US 3.71%, came down to at least the level to sustain society right now between 2005 and 2010. But look at Italy. We had the joke in Italy. When was it? In 2000?
500 years.
In 500 years, you have 16 Italians left. And you see, this is the reason why. Obviously, you have even less people in Portugal. And yeah, Ireland is sustainable. Sweden, close. France, close. Yeah, that already considers immigration. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so you see that we are living on a time bomb if it comes to aging society. Are there reasons for that? There are certain reasons. Higher labor force participation by women, obviously. So many women are choosing rather a full-time career than having children. Easier access to contraception, legalization or quasi-legalization of abortion, strange enough, lower infant mortality that brings about a trend to having fewer kids, and most importantly, the influences of the modern welfare state. There was a study in 2005, and I'm coming to a close with that, a study in 2005 that shows that almost all states with large pension pay-as-you-go systems have fertility rates below replacement level. A 2007 study in 50 states around the globe of fertility rates, pensions, and other variables indicate that higher social security contributions and other pension taxes had a significant effect, negative effect obviously, on fertility rates. And an economist in Germany just recently wrote in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, I guess, previously children had to care for their aging parents, which had raised and cared for them while they had been young. With our modern pay-as-you-go public pension schemes, these links of mutual dependencies have been gradually broken, thus leading also to another ethical decline regarding family ties and responsibilities. As the population ages, we see declines in private and public savings. The pace of economic growth subsequently weakens, he says. A declining economic growth rate makes pensions harder to provide. This leads to higher taxation, which reduces the income of those who are working even further. They, in return, respond, obviously, by having fewer children, because they simply cannot afford them, which makes the problem even worse. So you see, there is one more point that Sam Gregg stresses in his marvelous book, Becoming Europe, and this is that there is a difference in attitude. Just today there was an article in the Austrian daily Die Presse where they were comparing the Swiss society and the Austrian society, and they were saying, why is it possible, for example, to have a deficit blocker in the Swiss constitution, which we do not have in Austria? So where the government can't spend over a certain amount of money compared to GDP, because the Swiss have a different work ethic and a different attitude. And they go on saying, so first you need to change the attitude, for example, in our society, in order to bring down and scale back the welfare state. Yeah, so that's basically, I could go on for hours and hours, as you might be afraid, but that's basically some facts about what is going on in Europe and in the world, connected to our worldview, the Christian anthropology, Catholic social teaching, and connecting to the negative effects of our development within our society. And I will close with that. I hope that all the lectures that you had during these couple of days could be a reply to some of your questions that you might have had, or even raised more questions, becoming skeptical to what is going on in politics in your countries, in our country, and maybe that we are altogether becoming able to change something for the better, or at least to give the right answers to questions that our fellow family members, friends, colleagues at work or whatever might have if they are talking about politics. Thank you very much. And